Welcome to 30 Flirty and Panicking, your go-to podcast for embracing the unexpected and building a life you love. I'm Kelsey, and today is a big one because back in the spring, I got to sit down with Dr. Sarah Hensley, a specialized social psychologist who's been studying the science behind attachment and attraction for 20 years, for a conversation that I genuinely cannot wait to share with you. She's about to share invaluable insights that will change the way that you approach certain relationships. Dr. Hensley's built a social following of more than 1.5 million people, thanks to her easy-to-understand videos breaking down attachment styles and the psychology behind relationships. And her content truly found me when I needed it the most. If I'm being honest, her insights were part of the original inspiration behind this podcast because I want us all to be equipped with the knowledge and the tools that can allow us to better understand ourselves and others and form healthier relationships. So consider this conversation your toolkit for building stronger connections starting today. And with that, let's get into it. Dr. Hensley, I was just telling you, I'm so honored to have you here today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
I would love to give you an opportunity to share what it is that you do and kind of what got you interested in doing it.
Yeah, so I started studying social psychology as a graduate student. So I went to graduate school for social psychology. I ended up getting 2 concentrations, one in social psychology, one in health psychology. And when I started research in graduate school, I was really interested in the protective factors of romantic relationships in terms of chronic illness. And so, I was really kind of deep into that subject. And then I just kind of spun out from there and really fell in love with attachment theory because of what a solid psychological theory it was. It's been around since 1958. And in the field of science, we sort of operate from this principle of falsifiability. So something's really only true in a finding until it's not true, right? We might find later that that finding that we came across in an earlier study no longer applies because additional research has sort of debunked it. And since 1958, through tens of thousands of scientific studies, nobody has debunked attachment theory. And the core sort of components of attachment theory are this idea that our earliest childhood experiences with our caregivers give us this blueprint for intimacy that we then carry with us into our adult relationships, and it plays out really well. So attachment theory is almost scarily predictive of how people will behave inside of their romantic relationships. And during that time in graduate school, I was recently married. I got married in my mid-20s. And that marriage was just full of problems from sort of day one. And I was really almost using my academic interests to try to personally help my own marriage, right? So there was this big parallel between what I was interested in academically and then what I was trying to figure out in my personal life to improve my marriage. And so I would spend, before I had kids, I would spend sort of hours just reading through scientific studies, trying to figure out like, why can I not make this work when I was so in love with this person before I married him? And then when we got married, things just seemed to really shift and really change, and ended up getting pregnant with my first daughter. And after that, it got really bad. There were, issues with addiction on his side, with infidelity on his side, and things got worse and worse and worse. And I ended up staying in that marriage for 10 years. And there were so many times throughout that marriage where I knew that I needed to leave, but I couldn't ever find the courage to actually follow through with leaving. And I didn't know why I couldn't. It was like I knew that I had attachment issues, but it was one of those things where doctors kind of make the worst patients. Like I knew what my problems were, that I had codependency issues and I had some attachment anxiety and I had, a lot of wounding from my childhood. And I figured all of those things out. But it wasn't enough for me to really execute secure boundaries and really stepping up to leave that relationship that was abusive and was not fulfilling me in any way. And so the more, I was trying to fix myself, the more I was obsessed with this theory that seemed to predict so much of what was happening. But again, it was like knowledge just didn't translate into behavior change for me. And then when I got out of that relationship, I had a number of personal tragedies. My ex-husband, the man that I was just speaking about that I was married to, father of my 2 children, he ended up passing away very suddenly
I'm so sorry.
and unexpectedly. from his addiction issues that were a problem in our marriage. And at that very same time, within a couple of weeks, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. My dog of 16 years passed away. And then I started dating somebody very soon out of my divorce, which was another mistake and something that I should have known better wasn't a good idea, that I didn't take the proper amount of time to heal from that marriage. And this person was actually a dismissive avoidant, which, if you watch my content, you know they are very, very likely to run away and get spooked over anything really in the relationship. And so when I had these stressors pop in, instead of him leaning in and saying, I'm here to support you, I love you, he really leaned out and sort of disappeared. And so it was like all of my attachment wounds were just sort of on fire because I had lost all of my attachments in such a short period of time. And I thought, "N this is not this is not gonna be okay." I really sunk and spiraled down into a very bad place. I ended up being diagnosed with vestibular migraine, which is essentially a disease of an overstressed nervous system, and I thought, "I have to do something. I have to heal. I have to figure it out." Obviously, all this knowledge I have is not enough for me to feel safe in my own nervous system, to choose good partners, to be able to handle the stress in my life. And I have these 2 little girls that I have to take care of and I have to raise, and I cannot leave them and they need their mom. And so I did what I've always I've always done, which was I sank into the science, and God really met me where I was at then too and really supported me in my faith. And Jesus kind of brought me to the point where I could at least try to do the work, the psychological work that I needed to do on myself. And I dug into the science of nervous system regulation and repair after trauma, and what leads you to go from PTSD to post traumatic growth, and what are the factors that predict that. And so I just started really digging into those things, and I came across some really important work. Nicole Sachs, Alan Gordon and his work. Thais Gibson was a really great person that I had been following for a long time, and her work. And I found a lot of science in the realm of nervous system repair and attachment healing, and sort of the mindset work and the emotional processing work that needed to be done for me to really make some changes in my attachment. And I dedicated like a whole year of my life to that. And I came out of that year just a totally different person. My nervous system really made some profound transformations. My mindset was totally different. I had really strong faith. My mom went into remission from pancreatic cancer.
Good.
My kids were doing pretty well, with therapy, and we were just sort of thriving. I kind of pulled myself out of that mess. And soon after that, I went back on the dating market. I met a couple of nice guys. But when I met my husband, the day that I met him, I just knew that I was going to marry him. And on our first date, he took me through his healing journey that he had been on for the last year, where he was isolated for the last year after his divorce,
Wow.
and been on a healing journey to just heal himself and his attachment traumas that he had. He had a very rough childhood. He was in the military for a number of years in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He was gravely injured in Afghanistan. He's a Purple Heart veteran, and so he had quite a bit of shock traumas and other things in his life that were difficult. And he kind of came to the same realization I did after his divorce: like, I've got to do something to choose a healthy partner and to be healthy myself, and you know, to heal this trauma that I've been through. And so our journeys were just so parallel that it was almost insane. And our faith was so similar. We were both very strong Christians and had gotten really close to God as well during that time. And we ended up getting married, and it's just been a wild ride ever since, in terms of I started just making TikToks about what I had done in my own healing journey, and I started accumulating a pretty big following. And then my husband was like, why don't you start a business? Like, why don't you put yourself out there and teach people, in maybe a coaching capacity, what you have learned? And so I did that. And, as my regular job, before I opened my coaching practice, I was the program director for the 2 graduate programs in psychology, the PsyD program and the PhD program at the University of the Cumberlands, which is a smaller institution here in Kentucky. And that was a very fulfilling role. I had been in academia for pretty much my whole career, but I was kind of ready for a change, and my coaching practice just really started to take off. So eventually I sort of retired from that position and then scaled my business. And now we are here, like 3.5, almost 4 years later. So
Well,
it's been
I'm
a ride.
already a fan of your husband's because thank goodness he encouraged you to do this because
Yes.
like I said, I kid you not, I saw one of your videos. I couldn't tell you what the breakdown of people out there is. You probably could. I hadn't heard of attachment theory before in my entire life. So your
Yeah.
video entered my world and I was like, "Oh my gosh, she's talking about me." And it helped
Yeah.
me in my case. It was a little bit too late to do anything in my relationship, but it has helped me so deeply in the aftermath to understand and to be empathetic and to look inward and all of that. And
Absolutely.
something that you just mentioned, you just shared the beautiful story of you meeting your current husband and the relationship that you have together. And I think something that seems to be a common thread with both of you is that there was a level of awareness that you knew
Oh,
what I did not know and really did the work. Can you set up for people at home who maybe are just hearing about attachment theory for the first time as well, what are, the attachment styles that we see in play? Can you kind of set up those dynamics?
absolutely. So we have 4 different attachment styles. We have one that is secure. So that is where we all want to strive to be. Securely attached people essentially usually grew up with a nuclear family, so parents that stayed married. Their parental sort of romantic relationship that they witnessed growing up was really healthy and respectful. Parents were able to give their children good emotional attunement, so they were able to really attune to not just problem solving or instrumental support, with their children, making sure their children have what they need, but really tuning into what is going on in my child's world emotionally and how can I help them understand their emotions and process their emotions as they grew up. So they had this sort of guide in their life that could help them process their emotions properly. And not a lot of us had parents that were really equipped to do that.
Mhm.
Okay. So we may have had parents who were very reactive or had some kind of dysfunction while we were growing up. And those individuals that had those types of parents generally develop what we call fearful avoidant attachment, which is one of the insecure styles. And so, fearful avoidant attachment is really based on having childhood trauma and being very hypervigilant and sort of being disorganized in the way that you approach intimacy. So, people with fearful avoidance may really want to connect and be very intimate and close with other people, but they have a deep wound around betrayal because of their childhood trauma. And so, they tend to then be very hyper vigilant that they might be hurt or take small things that happen and kind of make them a bigger deal in their mind. And then they will really push away people very hard, and then want to pull them back in again once they feel a little better. So they create this real push pull dynamic inside of relationships. And then we have people that are more highly anxious inside of relationships, and they tended to grow up with parents that they would generally report, my parents were great. They loved me, but when I dig into their childhoods, I see what's called intermittent reinforcement, was essentially this idea that parents could sometimes meet the needs of the child really well, but other times they were too unavailable. So we see this in households where both parents really worked a lot of hours, or sometimes this could happen if one parent was very emotionally available and the other was very emotionally distant. So it was like when you were with one parent, you got your emotional needs met, and then with the other parent, you did not. So there could be a number of characteristics, but that intermittent reinforcement where sometimes the emotional needs were met and sometimes they were not. And it just wasn't consistent enough for the child to feel secure in the parental relationship. So they developed what's called attachment anxiety, and we call that attachment style the anxious preoccupied. And so those individuals grow up and they tend to really always be in the direction of connecting, always trying to search for love. They tend to be very codependent. They get a lot of their worth and validation from being inside of a relationship. They sort of have this blueprint that, I should always be with my partner once we're exclusive. That means we're connected at the hip. And so they can almost push people away by being too needy or too clingy inside of relationships. And they really tend to have poor boundaries. So they're really focused on how can I be what my partner needs me to be so that I will get the love and affection that I want, instead of, is my partner meeting my needs and am I happy inside of the relationship? So they have a really deep fear of abandonment, and they'll kind of take whatever they can get as long as they are still with the partner. So they can stay in bad relationships for a really long period of time just because they don't have those boundaries and they really are scared of being alone. And then on the opposite end of that attachment, we have some attachments that are called dismissive avoidant. And so those individuals, they grew up usually, again, they report, hey, I had good parents. Like my parents were around, they, loved me. And so I have to dig a little deeper with those folks too and ask them, could you go to your parents for emotional support when you were a kid? And that is the light bulb moment when those folks usually go, no, I would have never done that. And I say, well, why not? Why couldn't you talk to your parents about your emotions, like when you were scared or confused? And they just kind of look at me and they say, I just would not have done that. I just never would have occurred to me. It's just not something we did in our household. We didn't talk about those things. So they essentially usually grew up in a fairly loving home where parents were really around quite a bit and instrumentally supportive. So maybe mom packed the lunches and, dad went to the practices and games or whatever, but in terms of asking about how the child was doing emotionally, that never happened. And then if the child, when they were younger, let's say, brought the parents some kind of emotional experience, like I'm sad or I'm upset or was displaying emotion, they would get dismissed, ignored, or even punished. And sometimes this looked very benevolent and it would be like, oh, calm down, you're fine, don't be so upset. So it wasn't always this harsh, punishment over emotions. Sometimes it was very benign looking. But when a child is learned, that emotions are not safe to express because they'll be dismissed or ignored, they stop expressing and they start suppressing their emotions. And so dismissive avoidance, they tend to develop this wound around defectiveness and like kind of like this idea that, well, everybody else that I'm around doesn't seem to have these emotions that I have inside of me. So that must mean there's something wrong with me for having these emotional experiences. And so they sort of take that with them and they learn to keep their emotions to themselves and they develop fears around being vulnerable inside of their relationships and being close and committed inside of a relationship. And so they grow up and they might get into a relationship and do pretty good at first. But once expectations for commitment and more intimacy start creeping up or conflict, as is natural, when you get closer to somebody can creep up, they get very triggered by those things and they tend to really distance themselves in long-term relationships. And their partners tend to complain that they don't prioritize them and that they are not vulnerable enough and that they don't meet their partner's needs. So we have essentially those three insecure types. We have the anxious preoccupied, the dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied being too close, the dismissive avoidant being too distant, and then the fearful avoidant is really a combination of those two things. They can be close or distant just depending upon what is going on. So that makes up, those three insecure styles make up about 80% of our population. And research is showing that even the number of secure people today, which is about 20%, is dwindling. And we have some, you know, theories as to why that might be. For example, more technology sort of creeping in and social comparison and other things related to social media and technology. But that is not very encouraging. We need to really be aware that, number one, the way that we parent our kids is actually a lot more influential than we could ever imagine. Kids are not necessarily as resilient as we think that they are. They're very, very much influenced by our interactions with them when they are children. And then our own romantic relationship is so influential on how a child will develop their attachment inside of adulthood and how their attachment will play out. So that is essentially attachment theory in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for breaking that down because it's just helps so much to have context. And I'm sure of the people listening, there are people that have recognized in this moment, oh, that sounds like it could be
Yeah.
me or like it could be
Yep.
my partner. And it starts to help
Mhm.
make sense with things that I think otherwise might be challenging to make sense of sometimes. As a young 30 something year old that as of a year ago was going to probably have a baby in my arms right now. The thought that parenting has such a significant impact on your child's ability to form relationships later in life is a little terrifying for all the parents out there or the soon to be parents or the one day want to be parents. What can we keep in mind? How do we grow that 20% of the population?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, the hallmark of secure attachment is a well regulated nervous system. So, parents that really raise secure children are able to maintain regulation when their kids are dysregulated. So, if a child is throwing a tantrum, or a child is back talking you, or you have an older child who is rebelling in some way, your ability to stay calm and what we call attuned, which is really dialed into their emotional experience, is incredibly important. So if we can stay calm and we can actually validate our child's emotional experiences and let them sort of know that it's okay for them to have these experiences, but also give them developmentally appropriate ways to cope with their, big emotions that they may have as they're growing up, as well as being able to keep really good boundaries with our children as well. So we're not necessarily talking about being a pushover either and allowing our children to just get their way, but we can parent in a way that holds these boundaries, that has high standards for respect and for rule following and for things that we need our kids to do, while also being empathetic towards their emotional experiences if they don't get their way or if they act out and they have to be corrected, right? We can validate them. For example, I have an 8-year-old, and she's in that stage of just being not quite a little kid, but not quite a big kid either, right? She's really in this intermediate stage where, sometimes she can seem really mature and just, you tell her to do something, it's yes, yes, mom, absolutely, and she'll hop right on it. And then there's other times where it's kind of whiny and I don't want to do that, or, you get some pushback. And so a simple way, to deal with that is not going to be, no, because I said so, go do it right now, and kind of raise your voice, or, if you don't do it, you're going to, sit in timeout or give some kind of big consequence. If there's back talk, it can be like, oh, wow, I don't really love how you spoke to me right now. Would you like to redo that? And just give your child an opportunity to correct themselves, right? And then if they can't, then you say, well, I don't appreciate you speaking to me like that. That's not very respectful. And so, unfortunately, you won't be allowed to, insert whatever it is they were going to do later. Maybe that was fun or whatever. And, unless you're willing to make a correction. And so you can give 1 or 2 chances to make a correction, and then, nope, that's it. The boundary is in place. You must go, do whatever you were supposed to do, or they're whatever they were going to do that was fun, they don't get to do it, right? There has to be some kind of consequence, which is the boundary. But you don't have to yell, and you don't have to get upset, and you don't have to shame them in any way. And you can also add some validation. I understand that you're disappointed that you don't get to do that, and that you didn't make the choice that would have allowed you to do that. I understand that you feel upset about this. I can see why you would be upset, right? So there's ways that we can speak back to them about their emotional experiences, but also toe the line, right? And no, you're not allowed to do that because you were disrespectful. Or, we can teach them that, for example, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, that, and we have to step in and we have to do that task for them. So say my older daughter, my 14-year-old, she doesn't clean her room, right? Her room tends to be kind of messy, as most teenage rooms are.
Right.
I can say, hey, Gabs, if you don't clean your room by 5 p.m., I'm going to come in and clean it. And then you're going to have to pay me to clean it. So whatever is in your, she has a little green light account, and in your savings, I charge $20 an hour. If it takes me, an hour, I'm going to take that money out of your, your green light account, which is money that she's worked for, to earn. And so I've taught her, this is how the real world works. Like, you can either do something yourself or you have to pay somebody to do it. Right. So I don't come in and say, your room is such a mess, and how do you live like this? And it's so gross, and you don't clean up after yourself. And I don't rant and rave, or, I don't just let her get away with living in, a room with clothes all over the floor and with, trash all over the place. She's going to have to live to that standard, but I can give her a way to meet that standard that's very calm and that has a clear consequence associated with not fulfilling that responsibility. So, really, the hallmark of attachment parenting is staying calm, holding your boundaries, still validating their emotional experiences, but really following through on those boundaries and not letting them push those boundaries, because that just reinforces worse behavior.
Thank you on behalf of the parents of, of the world for that toolkit. I'm saving this
Yeah.
forever, and sending it to all of my friends with little kids. When you're in a relationship with somebody, should you know what your partner's attachment style is? And if so, when When are you deep enough into something where you would be able to pick up on things like this?
Yes. So I will say that you don't know someone until at least 4 months.
Mhm.
Okay. 4 months is like the minimum
Yeah,
of what you will sort of have in terms of the newer dating phase that is going to eventually wear off. You've got about 4 months of that. Okay.
right,
And in the initial dating phase, people are obviously trying to put their best foot forward. And a lot of times there hasn't been enough closeness or enough intimacy or even enough conflict to reveal people's attachment traumas and their trauma related behaviors. And so I definitely wouldn't be making any big commitments with anybody outside of the 4 month mark. In fact, I always tell people I would wait to be exclusive with someone, like, no sooner than absolute bare minimum 3 months. But if you can wait 4 months, better, because you're going to want to look for how people handle difficult conversations, handle being told, hey, I would like to see something different happening, or this thing that happened hurt me. And can we talk about it? Right. How do the first couple conflicts go?
right,
If they don't go well, they are not going to go well as the relationship progresses. In fact, they are going to get much, much worse because people are still trying to put their best foot forward inside of the relationship in this early stage. And so I also talk about, key questions that you can ask people during the dating phase that can kind of reveal if they have these attachment insecurities. And so one of the questions that I like to tell my clients to go ask in the dating phase is, how did you get over your last long-term relationship? What was that experience like in terms of moving on from a past partner? And so it's kind of a red flag if nobody's had a lot of past serious relationships. So if somebody's say in their 30s and they're like, well, I've never really dated somebody longer than 2 months, right? Well, there's a little bit of a red flag, right? You're 30 something years old and you've never had a relationship longer than a few months. That screams dismissive avoidant,
hmm
screams fear of intimacy. And if they have had a past romantic relationship that had some longevity to it, if they show up and they say, well, we just weren't compatible and it just was what it was. And, I didn't really have to do anything to get over it. I just knew that it wasn't right. Again, that's another highly avoidant response because most people secure people can acknowledge that having a long term relationship end is painful and that they needed to do something focused on their own growth and their own healing to move past it. And so if you have somebody kind of saying, it just was what it was, we just weren't good together, and isn't talking about, well, it was hard, but I leaned into my faith, or I actually went to therapy, or I read some books, or I did something, right? That was valuable to my own personal growth, to move on from that relationship. To me, that's a little bit of a red flag. If you have a partner that is saying in the dating phase, oh, my ex was awful, they were so terrible, and they're so highly focused on everything that their partner did wrong, and they never once kind of say, and I realized I brought XYZ thing, baggage or problem to the relationship, and it's something I had to work through. Again, that shows a lack of self-awareness and sort of a propensity to be a blame shifter, right? Somebody that
yeah.
maybe can't take accountability for their own behavior inside of a relationship. And so I like to tell people, ask, be curious, in the first few weeks to months of dating somebody about what are their interests, and specifically look if they have any interest in personal growth and development, because a lot of people that have these insecure styles are not. They'll, in fact, really shy away and be uncomfortable with the idea of emotional growth or personal development. They may be interested in fitness or finance or things like that, but when it comes to their emotions, they don't want to touch that. And so that is sort of a way to poke and to prod a little bit and to test the waters on how interested people are in developing their own character.
So say you are, you're 6 months in with somebody and you are so into them, and it starts to become clear that maybe they are a dismissive avoidant. When do you know that it's something worth working through versus something that you should cut yourself free from?
Yes. So again, if you notice, and dismissive avoidants are so notorious for coming in kind of strong in the first 4 to 6 months. And then that 4 to 6 month mark is just a real trigger for them because it's again where the natural expectation to become closer and to become exclusive and to really get to know each other better, it starts to become relevant. And so that time frame for them can just be very triggering. And if you notice that they start distancing themselves, like you will notice that they do not contact you as much. You will notice that their text messages are not as affectionate or as long and intricate, and they are not asking you as many questions, and they are not as interested in your life. You can just feel the drop off, right? It just becomes very, very noticeable at that time frame. You need to go to them and you need to say, hey, I'm starting to notice some distance, and I'm just letting you know that this distance doesn't feel great to me. And so I'm curious what could be going on. And I'm curious if you are willing to sort of go back to this level of intimacy that we had before. Right. And here's what that looked like to me. It looked like, we kind of we texted multiple times a day, or we went out a couple of times a week, and now it's like I only see you every other week. So I'm wondering if you're able to sort of recommit to giving that level of interest or that level of commitment, to the relationship. And if they deny that it's happening, like, I don't know what you're talking about, like, I don't I'm fine, everything's great, like, I maybe I've been just a little busy at work. And if they kind of blow you off, that is a huge red flag, huge, enormous. It means that they don't see it, that they have their dismissive avoidant blinders on. Those blinders are just going to get worse. They're just grow more distant over time, and it's gonna be a heartbreaker situation. So I would say cut it loose. Or if they say, yeah, okay, I hear you on that. I have been extra busy, but you're right. I need to step it up. I can tell that I've been, off my game. I'm totally in this. That's great. Give them a shot and see if they follow through. Most of the time, there will be a total lack of follow through if there's a dismissive avoidant. So that's again them making those false promises, and that is something that they will do throughout the relationship as well. Is that if you confront them and they do agree to make changes, you will see absolutely no follow through. And so you're just going to have to test the waters in that next few weeks and see, are they able to correct this distancing, right? And if they don't, you need to cut it off. You need to let it go because you cannot allow your fear of detachment to put you into a situation where you are going to be set up for long-term heartbreak. It's
Yeah.
just not, it is not worth it. But a lot of people do. They're attached with their own attachment anxiety because most of the time these people have some insecure attachment, right? And they have attachment anxiety that's being activated by the avoidance or the space. Their attachment anxiety makes them want to try harder
Mhm.
instead of to set a boundary and leave the relationship. And so if you are finding yourself being anxious, like, why haven't they texted me? Why haven't they called me? Oh my gosh, I feel this space. That's a sign that you need to work on what you can control, which is your own attachment.
If there is somebody who wants to make it work so badly and now can be armed with this information from you, right? And they see, my partner has dismissive avoidant tendencies, and I know that, if I manage this in one direction, it will give us a better shot at success than if I
Mhm.
manage it in another direction. Where's your threshold there?
So here's where that tricky sort of lesson that took me so many years to learn, that necessarily knowing what's going on does not mean you can execute something differently, because when people's attachment anxiety is triggered, if they don't have the tools to be able to regulate their own nervous system and find safety in their own nervous system and be able to correct their own painful narratives that they've had in their head for their entire lives without really even acknowledging them, you're still going to react in those triggers. Like, you think that you'll be able to approach it differently, but when the moment comes and they're denying or they're blame shifting or they're shutting down, your attachment anxiety is going to kick in, and you will land in that trauma response anxiety behavior every single time, which is usually going to be fight, flight, or, sometimes even fawn for anxious individuals. And you're going to chase and you're going to beg and you're going to get emotional. And that is because that is how your nervous system is reacting to that potential threat of abandonment or betrayal inside of the situation.
Right.
So, what I tell people is, you can have all of the best intentions to handle things differently, but knowing generally does not equal being able to be successful in managing someone else's insecurities, right? And
Mhm.
that's not your job to manage someone else's insecurities. Your job is to show up authentically, whatever that looks like. If you are sensitive, if you are emotional, if you are empathetic, that is how you need to show up because you need to like you at the end of the day, right? That is the most important thing. And when we show up inauthentically in our relationships, it really does further damage to our nervous system. We
Yeah.
become more dysregulated and more insecure over time. And so we have to be able to just show up as we are
Mhm.
without any fear or reservation around, well, maybe that'll push them away, or maybe it'll cause a fight. Being kind, being respectful, being, able to listen to their perspective and feelings. Those are required and those are things that I teach. But ultimately, if they can't give you what you need, or they can't even be responsive and empathetic to what you're telling them that you need, they're never going to meet your needs anyway.
Mhm.
It's a lost cause,
Yeah.
right? End it there. You have to be able to be authentic. And so many people that come into my practice are like, well, I would love to say that, or I would love to draw that boundary, or I would love to let them know that this is painful to me, but I'm afraid I'm going to overwhelm them and then they're going to leave the relationship. And I'm like, again, if asking for what you need makes someone run away, they were never planning on giving it to you anyway.
Yeah, that's not
It
a
was never getting your needs met situation anyway, right?
yeah.
So you have to just be able to be secure enough and work on your nervous system to the point where you can be secure enough to show up authentically and ask for what you need and hold boundaries around when you're not getting your needs met.
And I think on that note, it is so easy for people to hold on to potential. Like everything about it is perfect except for this one thing. And if we just make it through this one thing, or if he can just overcome X, Y, or Z, or we just need to conquer this or that. What can you tell people about potential?
What I will tell people is whatever you are seeing in the moment,
Mhm.
multiply it by about 30% to 40%, and that is what you are going to see if you marry this person. People do not get better over time, people get worse over time. And that is a fact. And so, wherever you are in the relationship, realize whatever next stage you go to, those bad qualities are going to be amplified. And so the only person you can control in the dynamic is you. And so, of course, you want to have some introspection and say, what am I bringing to the table? Right? Am I too reactive? Am I too critical? Am I too needy and clingy? What do I have going on? And focus on working on those things and then see, do things change for the better? But if you know that I'm generally trying to show up the best that I can here, like I'm respectful, I'm kind, I'm empathetic, I have a healthy level of independence, but at the end of the day, this person is just too distant or they're too disrespectful during conflict. And you asking for what you need keeps getting denied through their behavior. You can't put up with that. You have to have your own boundaries because it's not going to get better. But generally, I always say first line strategy, take accountability for what you can and see what happens while also making it clear what your needs are and what your expectations are and hold those boundaries and see what happens. But ultimately, people aren't going to get better over time. They don't get better with more commitment. They don't get better when you have children. All of those things tend to make people feel more stressed and exacerbate any attachment insecurities that they have.
And I imagine your answer to this might be similar. What would you say to somebody that is currently teetering on the edge of a return to a relationship that,
Mhm.
has previously fallen apart?
Right. Well, first I have empathy because I used to be a fearful avoidant. So I had a lot of attachment trauma. And I was very, very trauma bonded to my first husband because there was an abusive situation. And I legally divorced him and got back together with him after I divorced him. So there is no judgment from me,
Mhm.
right, on that end. But from a place of now being attachment secure and being in a healthy, secure relationship, I can say you need to decide if you are actually experiencing toxic hope instead of a true desire to enter back into a relationship that just ended too soon for maybe other reasons, right? I mean, sometimes people have certain incompatibilities and it seems like it can't be overcome. And then with more thought to the situation from both parties, they can come back together and make compromises. That does happen. But for a lot of people, the other partner and their insecurities are such a driving force that it's not going to matter how many changes you make to yourself. You're going to step into a relationship with somebody who didn't make any changes, right? And so I would say look and see for the evidence that your partner has, in fact, been trying to make changes. Have they started going to therapy? Do they take full accountability for their end of what went wrong in the relationship? If they can't take accountability for it and they aren't taking any active steps to make changes, just saying, hey, you know what, I won't do that again, that's not going to work because people's behavior inside of relationships, again, is subconscious. It's coming from a place of attachment trauma. And so people can't just say, I'm not going to repeat my attachment trauma. That's not how this works. These things are ingrained into their nervous systems, and it takes tools and it takes, dedicated effort to make these types of changes where you can stay calm during conflict or you can remain engaged when you feel like shutting down. That takes work. That
Mhm.
takes growth. And so don't take lip service. Look for actions that person is making towards growing and changing.
For anybody who's just come out of a relationship and is heartbroken right now and feels devastated, what words of wisdom or what advice can you give to somebody who is currently sitting here listening to this completely shattered inside in the aftermath of a relationship ending?
Yes. So, what I will say is that pain is the absolute best launching point for growth. The deeper the pain, the more you can grow. And so, we do know what takes people from really developing anxiety or depression after a breakup from someone who can grow and thrive and become more secure after a breakup. And really, it's the dedication towards understanding their own attachment,
Mhm.
working on their mindset. We can tell ourselves some really, really painful stories that aren't true that can keep people really, really stuck, right? Like, oh, well, I wasn't good enough or I wasn't worth, changing for, or whatever those painful stories are. We have to be willing to be objective and correct them and work on our mindset. We need to be able to actually process through the emotions of the loss. And most people do not know how to properly process their emotions. And that would be a whole big lecture if people are interested in how to actually process their emotions so that their anxiety will decrease and that their pain will go away, then they can consider, working with me or my team. But you have to process your emotions. And most people don't. They either band-aid their emotions or suppress their emotions. And so you are not going to be able to heal and move on in a timely manner if you don't truly get into your own emotional processing work. So that is something really, really important. And then lastly, you need to be able to realize that you are trading temporary pain for potential long-term success here, right? Whereas staying in an unhealthy relationship is perpetual pain. It's indefinite pain. And so you don't want to return to a bad relationship because of this temporary pain that you're just now experiencing. You will move through it. You can work through it. There's some amazing resources out there. There's a lot of people out there doing what I'm doing. I don't know if they're doing it in the same way that I'm doing it, but they're dedicated towards healing and towards growth. So move in that direction. Don't keep looking over your shoulder about what could have been, because if it was going to work, you probably wouldn't be broken up. Like, it's called a breakup because it's broken. And there was a book at one point that was really popular called that. And that's a good book. They should check it out. It's called a breakup because it's broken. So look towards the future, realize this is temporary, do the work it takes to heal and process those emotions, and you'll come out better on the other side.
We'll drop that book in the show notes. If there is one thing that someone can take away from the conversation that you and I have shared here or the work that you do, what's one thing you want to leave listeners with?
The only person you can control is yourself. And your own self-worth depends upon the level of effort you put in developing the relationship that you have to yourself. So the more you care about yourself in terms of making sure that the relationships around you are healthy, that you are taking good care of yourself both emotionally and physically, is just so vital. Because if you don't love yourself enough, you cannot possibly love someone else. in a secure and healthy way. And so the only thing you can do is work on your own attachment, work on your own personal growth and development, work on that loving relationship you have towards yourself. Because at the end of the day, you can't control another person no matter how much you beg, plead, stomp, cry, demand. You can't control them. They're going to react in terms of their capacity that they have to behave in terms of their own attachment wounding. So people don't really treat you how they feel about you. They treat you to the degree they can handle their own attachment wounds. So work on yours instead of trying to control someone else's.
I love that. It breaks my heart a little bit to think that there are so many good human
Yeah.
beings that don't want to hurt anybody, that want to be parents or husbands or wives, and just lack the toolkit that they need to be able to do it. And I wish every single person could hear the information that you share and just do the work so that you can have everything that you hope for.
Right. You can. And secure people tend to attract and be attracted to other secure people. So, becoming attachment secure is one of the greatest gifts you will ever give to yourself, to any future children that you have, because the person that you choose to be your life partner is the most influential choice you'll ever make in your life. It affects every area of your life and every area of your success. And it really, really predicts your level of happiness in your future. So, it's important. We can't just be out there willy nilly, choosing whoever because we don't want to be alone. That's not a good strategy. That's the strategy I used. And it didn't get me very far. It created a lot of pain.
And look at you now, helping so many other people to get to where you are, hopefully. Thank you, Dr. Hensley, for having this conversation. Thank you
Oh,
for your time. I know how busy you are, and it has genuinely meant the world to me.
yes. Thank you so much. And if people are interested, they can find me at my website, thelovedoc.com, where they can follow the Love Doc podcast. I'm also under Dr. Hensley, it's Dr. Sarah Hensley, the Love Doc on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So there are plenty of places to find me.
Can't recommend it enough.
I'm Dr. Sarah Hensley, and I hope after this conversation, everybody will feel 30, flirty, and secure.